The air was heavier than usual that evening, and I could feel it pressing against my chest the moment I stepped into the small chapel at the edge of town. The wooden pews smelled faintly of wax and dust, and the flickering candlelight cast shadows that seemed too deliberate, too aware of my movements. I had come here to pray, hoping for the kind of solace that had always accompanied Father Lucas' sermons, but the peace I expected never arrived. Instead, there was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible, that made my skin crawl. The cross hanging above the altar, which I had walked past countless times without a second thought, now seemed to pulse with a quiet tension, as if it were aware of my unease and silently judging me. My eyes darted around the empty chapel, expecting someone to appear, a friend or a parishioner perhaps, but no one came. The silence was unnerving, the kind that doesn't just fill a room but stretches into your thoughts, clawing at certainty. I took a step closer to the altar, and for an instant, I thought I saw the shadow of a figure moving just beyond the candle light, though when I blinked, there was nothing. The hairs on the back of my neck stood rigid, and a cold whisper seemed to brush past my ear, even though no one was there. I wanted to leave, to escape the inexplicable dread, yet my legs refused to obey, rooted to the worn floorboards by some force I couldn't name. Something about this evening felt irreversibly wrong, a small misalignment in the world that promised consequences I could not yet comprehend. And as I glanced up once more at the cross, a voice I didn't recognize echoed faintly in my mind, not aloud but in the very fabric of my consciousness, warning me of events that would unfold and linger far longer than I could imagine. What happened next would shock you. Before I could even process it, I needed to know, where are you watching this from, which city, which state? After that evening in the chapel, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, like the air itself had grown heavier in ways I hadn't noticed before. My small town in Texas was usually quiet this time of year, the sun dipping behind the low hills while the cicadas droned their endless hum across the dusty roads. Most nights, the streets were empty, only the occasional car's headlights cutting through the twilight. My life had always followed a predictable rhythm, mornings spent helping at my family's small hardware store, afternoons wandering the nearby fields to clear my head, and evenings dedicated to prayer or attending services at the modest church near the town center. Father Lucas had been a quiet figure in our lives for as long as I could remember, a man whose presence was steady but not commanding. He didn't need to raise his voice to be respected, the villagers trusted him instinctively. I had grown up under his watchful eyes, feeling the weight of his guidance even when he wasn't speaking directly to me. That trust made the unease that evening all the more unsettling. The chapel itself was an old building, constructed decades ago with thick, weathered oak beams and a limestone exterior that had yellowed in the relentless Texas sun. Inside, the wooden floors creaked beneath every step, and the faint scent of incense clung stubbornly to the corners. The cross that hung above the altar had been there for generations, passed down from one caretaker to another, a relic of the church's earliest days. Most of the time, it went unnoticed, blending into the background of sermons, weddings, and community gatherings. But that night, as I approached it, the familiar contours seemed sharper, the shadows cast by the flickering candlelight unnaturally deep. It wasn't just a matter of imagination, it was as if the cross itself had taken on a presence, an awareness that felt entirely separate from the quiet, solid sanctuary I had always known. I remember leaving the chapel reluctantly, stepping back into the cooling air of the early evening. The sky was painted in muted shades of amber and violet, the kind of light that makes the edges of the world look uncertain. Even the familiar streets felt foreign, as though the town had subtly rearranged itself without my notice. I walked home slowly, glancing at the rows of modest houses lining the main road. Each front porch was neatly kept, some adorned with potted plants or small American flags, yet everything felt oddly muted, as though the night had drained the colors from the neighborhood. My own home appeared unchanged, a modest brick house with peeling paint and a small yard where my mother tended a few tomato plants. Still, I felt a tension threading through the air, a sensation that I had entered a boundary I did not fully understand. At home, my family carried on as usual, seemingly unaware of the quiet shift that had followed me out of the chapel. My father was in the garage, tinkering with an old lawnmower, the faint smell of oil and gasoline mixing with the evening air. My mother was inside, arranging dishes for dinner while humming softly, her voice a gentle reminder of stability. My younger sister, Emily, sprawled on the living room floor with a sketchpad, absorbed in her drawings. Life, outwardly, remained ordinary. Yet beneath that surface, subtle oddities had begun to creep into our routines. The small bell above the front door, which normally chimed cheerfully when someone entered or left, sometimes rang on its own, though no one had crossed the threshold. Shadows in corners of rooms seemed to stretch farther than they should, lingering longer than natural light would allow. At first, I dismissed these sensations, blaming fatigue or my imagination, but a quiet anxiety began to settle in my chest, a nagging reminder that the familiar could no longer be fully trusted. Father Lucas continued his duties at the church with his characteristic calm, unaware or perhaps unwilling to acknowledge the subtle disturbances that had begun to infiltrate the parish. He greeted parishioners with a soft nod and gentle smile, his voice steady as he led evening prayers, yet even he could not conceal the weariness that had begun to edge into his eyes. He was a man burdened by knowledge few others possessed, and I had always sensed a certain gravity beneath his serene exterior, a weight he carried silently. It was that quiet burden that made his presence comforting, even reassuring. But that evening, as I watched him from the pews, a subtle shift in his posture suggested that he too was aware that something was amiss. Perhaps he recognized that the cross had changed, or perhaps he felt the first threads of an unseen danger that would not speak itself aloud. Whatever the source, I felt the first taste of uncertainty in a place that had always offered certainty. In the days that followed, our town remained unchanged in outward appearance, yet a persistent undercurrent of unease threaded through daily life. Conversations at the hardware store began to feel heavier, as if words carried more meaning than before, and glances exchanged in passing held weight beyond comprehension. The fields I walked in the afternoons, once tranquil and empty, began to feel different. The wind carried faint, unfamiliar whispers, rustling the long grasses in ways that suggested movement where none existed. Birds took flight suddenly, their calls sharp and discordant, and I found myself pausing, scanning the horizon for some sign, some rationale, though no logical explanation ever appeared. Even familiar paths felt altered, each turn and hill somehow capable of hiding something unknown. My interactions with neighbors, usually casual and friendly, grew taut with unspoken tension. I noticed small details I had never registered before, the way Mrs. Calloway's curtains twitched even when no wind passed, the sudden absence of Mr. Jenkins' dog from his yard when it should have been barking, or the faint creak of the old bell tower at church long after services had ended. The town itself seemed alive in a way that was unsettling, almost sentient, and I began to sense that ordinary life was now layered with the potential for observation, for events beyond comprehension. The familiar became uncertain. Every night, as I returned to my bedroom and closed the door behind me, I felt watched not by anyone tangible, but by something intangible, something that scrutinized and measured quietly, waiting for the smallest lapse in vigilance. Father Lucas remained a steady presence despite these shifts. He conducted evening prayers with the same careful cadence, blessing the congregation and offering counsel, yet there was a subtle gravity that clung to his words. I sensed he knew more than he revealed, a silent acknowledgement that the cross, once ordinary, had become something far more complicated than any of us were prepared to understand. I began to notice how often he lingered near the altar, his hands resting lightly on the aged wood of the pews, his eyes briefly touching the cross with a look that was almost mournful. It was as though he understood the responsibility of the object, the weight it carried, and the burden it would demand of those who came too close. I continued my routine, walking the fields and visiting the hardware store, but every day carried a subtle unease, a quiet reminder that nothing would remain truly ordinary. Shadows stretched in ways that felt deliberate, silence itself felt dense, and the cross, once a symbol of protection, seemed to hum with a quiet insistence, a presence that suggested vigilance rather than comfort. The chapel, the town, Father Lucas, everything I had trusted now bore an unspoken warning, a message that reality could no longer be taken for granted. Even in the midst of familiar routines, I felt the first stirrings of anticipation, a prelude to events that would gradually strip away certainty and expose the town, my family, and myself to forces that could not be reasoned with. And yet, despite all this, life continued with its ordinary motions. The sun rose and set, neighbors exchanged greetings, and children played in yards. But the undercurrent of tension persisted, a quiet, constant reminder that beneath the surface, something had changed. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of candle light, every shadow stretching too far seemed imbued with meaning. The cross remained central, a silent observer of lives unknowingly entwined with a presence that demanded vigilance. And though nothing overtly horrific had yet occurred, the emotional weight of knowing that the familiar could no longer be trusted pressed upon me. The stage was set, the town unaware, and I felt the first heavy tremors of a reality that was about to unravel in ways no one could have imagined. In the days that followed, the subtle unease grew heavier, creeping into moments that once felt mundane. I noticed it first in the quiet of my bedroom, where the cross above my dresser, once a comforting presence, seemed to shift imperceptibly when I wasn't looking. I would glance away and glance back, certain it had moved, yet the angles remained impossible to measure. Shadows pooled unnaturally in corners, stretching toward the walls as if searching for something hidden, and the air carried a weight that pressed on my chest whenever I entered the room. At first, I told myself it was exhaustion, the product of long days at the store and restless nights at home. But the sensation persisted, subtle yet undeniable, a quiet disturbance that gnawed at certainty. Even outside the house, the town felt slightly altered, though no one else seemed to notice. The streets I had walked for years felt narrower, the wind carrying a chill that hadn't been there the day before. Leaves rustled in patterns that seemed almost intentional, brushing against the sides of buildings as if to mark territory I hadn't recognized before. I began to hesitate when approaching familiar places, the old well by the schoolyard, the church steps, even the small general store where I had grown up buying pennies worth of candy. These were spots that should have offered comfort, yet something whispered that the ordinary was no longer safe. At times, I thought I heard faint murmurs when no one was present, voices just on the edge of comprehension, and each time I tried to rationalize them, the sound dissolved like mist in sunlight. Interactions with my family grew tinged with tension, though they were oblivious to the shifting atmosphere. My younger sister, Emily, began mentioning shadows she thought she saw from her bedroom window, describing movements that seemed impossible. My mother brushed it off as imagination, attributing it to the long summer evenings and the dimming light. My father remained practical and grounded, focused on his work in the garage, yet even he started glancing over his shoulder more often, an unease I had never noticed in him before. I realized then that I wasn't imagining it. The sense of being watched, the faint pressure in the air, the silent reminders that something unseen had begun observing us, was real. The cross, once a symbol of protection, now carried a quiet insistence, as if it were both observer and witness, holding secrets that were not yet revealed. I tried returning to the chapel, seeking reassurance from Father Lucas, hoping that his calm presence might offer clarity. He greeted me as always, his voice steady, eyes soft yet carrying a weight I hadn't understood before. As he guided me to a pew near the back, I noticed him glance at the cross above the altar in a way that suggested recognition, not surprise. Something had shifted, something subtle yet profound, and I knew he was aware. He didn't say anything, simply folding his hands in quiet prayer, allowing the silence to speak in place of explanation. The air in the chapel had changed, it no longer promised sanctuary, only the quiet reminder that faith could falter even in the most familiar places. The first tangible sign came one evening when I returned home later than usual. The bell above our front door had rung multiple times, though no one had entered. Emily was in the living room, her eyes wide and still, staring at the corner where the light of the setting sun cast an elongated shadow. She whispered my name, pointing toward the wall behind the couch. I approached slowly, my pulse quickening, and saw nothing at first. Then the shadow shifted, elongating unnaturally, moving against the angle of the light as though independent of the sun. I swallowed hard, trying to ground myself in reason, yet I could not explain the sensation that chilled my entire body. It was as though an invisible presence had entered the house, studying us quietly, marking the boundaries where it could and could not move. Sleep became restless, each night carrying a subtle dread I could not name. I would wake in the dark hours, hearing faint noises that seemed close yet were impossibly distant. Floorboards creaked under no discernible weight, whispers brushed past my ears, and the familiar weight of the cross above my dresser felt like a stern, watchful gaze. Sometimes I thought I saw movement from the corner of my eyes, a flicker of a figure that vanished when I tried to focus. Every morning, I would rise exhausted yet unable to dismiss the sensations entirely. Even in the clarity of daylight, I felt the invisible threads of observation pulling at the edges of my consciousness, a reminder that what was once safe and sacred had shifted subtly, irreversibly. Father Lucas remained calm, offering guidance in quiet tones that reassured yet unsettled simultaneously. One evening, as he led me through prayers, I noticed the faint tremor in his hands when he adjusted his robe. I realized then that even he, whose life had been devoted to faith and service, felt the weight of what was occurring. The cross above the altar had become more than a symbol, it was a participant in the quiet upheaval, a silent witness to forces that remained just beyond comprehension. The realization gnawed at me, faith alone might not protect, and understanding it fully was something we were not yet ready for. Small, inexplicable events continued to unfold around the house. The lamp in the living room would flicker without reason, shadows moved against the grain of sunlight, and objects subtly shifted from where I remembered placing them. Emily began avoiding certain corners of the house, mumbling about things she could feel but not see. My parents dismissed her words, though I knew better. A constant pressure seemed to linger in the air, a quiet awareness that the ordinary rhythm of life had been altered. Even the simplest routines, such as brewing coffee or locking the front door, now carried an underlying tension, a subtle reminder that the familiar could no longer be trusted. By the end of the week, it became impossible to ignore. The cross, present in every room, seemed to radiate a quiet insistence, a reminder that it was not merely a symbol but an active presence. I felt its weight in every movement, every glance, every heartbeat. The air carried the faintest hint of something unseen, a presence that observed rather than attacked, a subtle intelligence that measured faith and doubt with equal attention. My own prayers felt strained, words stumbling across my lips as if the very act of calling upon God carried a weight I was not prepared to bear. I had always believed that the sacred objects in my life offered protection, but now the cross seemed a reminder that faith could falter, that trust could be tested, and that vigilance was required even in the most familiar spaces. And yet, life went on with outward normality. My father continued his work, my mother maintained her routines, and Emily busied herself with her sketches. The town appeared unchanged to any casual observer. But I knew better. The quiet disturbances, the shifting shadows, the silent presence of the cross, all signaled that the ordinary was a fragile illusion. I felt both dread and curiosity, the urge to understand what had begun, balanced against the fear that some truths were not meant to be uncovered. Something was coming, something that would demand more than prayer or routine. I could feel it in the air, in the stretch of shadows, in the quiet insistence of the cross that had once been a symbol of certainty. The calm was gone, replaced by a slow, insidious awareness that nothing in my life would remain the same. And as I stared at the cross one evening, the faint outline of shadows shifting behind the glass frame, I whispered to myself the question I could not yet answer: how much of faith remained, and how much had already been lost? Father Lucas had always been a quiet presence in our town, a man whose kindness was measured and deliberate. No one ever suspected that beneath his calm demeanor lay burdens that stretched decades back, heavier than any ordinary conscience could bear. I first understood the depth of his responsibility one afternoon when I accompanied my grandmother to the chapel. She had always spoken of the cross that hung in the small alcove behind the altar, claiming it had been in the family of the church for generations, carried from one caretaker to the next. To me, it had always been an object of simple devotion, a comforting shape on the wall. That day, however, the air around it seemed thicker, as if the cross itself exhaled an almost imperceptible weight. Father Lucas approached quietly, his eyes lowering to meet mine with an expression I could not read. He didn't speak at first, simply gesturing for us to sit on the wooden pews that creaked under our weight. Then, slowly, he began to explain. Not in loud words meant to educate, but in the soft tones of someone revealing a secret long carried. The cross, he said, was never ordinary. It had been used in exorcisms, passed down through hands who had known suffering and confrontation with things no one else could comprehend. He did not speak of victories or heroics, only duty. He had inherited the responsibility years before, after the previous priest had left quietly, burdened by experiences that could not be spoken aloud. The cross was not a talisman that ensured safety, it was a tool, demanding understanding, reverence, and, sometimes, sacrifice. I listened in silence, trying to reconcile the man I had always known with this weight he carried. He described events from decades past, not in lurid detail, but with the precision of memory and the solemnity of necessity. Families who had sought help, situations where faith alone had been insufficient, the quiet toll that protecting others demanded. He did not claim to be brave. He claimed to be responsible. The cross was not a weapon to defeat evil, he explained, but a containment, a boundary that delayed what it could not eradicate. Its history was marked by the choices of those who had cared for it, the quiet decisions to protect others at a cost that could never be measured. As he spoke, I realized that the subtle disturbances in my home were not random. The cross had begun signaling its awareness, its presence shifting because the responsibility had passed, even partially, into my hands. Father Lucas's eyes lingered on mine with a weight that I could not fully grasp. Faith will be tested, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Not by spectacle, not by fear that can be shouted into the night. It will be tested quietly, in the decisions you make, in the choices you cannot avoid. He leaned closer, and I felt the gravity of every word pressing into my chest. The cross above the altar, the one I had dismissed for so long as a simple symbol, seemed to shimmer in a way that felt alive, aware of the presence of a newcomer into its history. He recounted an incident from his early years, a family in a neighboring town who had sought help after unexplained illnesses began to spread. Children would wake screaming, claiming they had seen figures that moved without sound, objects that shifted when no one was present. The adults had laughed at first, dismissing the events as imagination or coincidence, until a father refused to sleep in the house, the tension in his eyes undeniable. Lucas explained that the cross had been the only stabilizing presence, a silent mediator in the nights when the boundaries between the seen and unseen blurred. The experience had left him shaken but disciplined, teaching that vigilance required patience, observation, and the quiet endurance of uncertainty. The lessons were subtle but absolute. Fear could not be fought, only managed, and even faith could falter if its tools were ignored. It became clear that my town, small and seemingly ordinary, was not exempt from these burdens. Father Lucas did not speak of monsters or demons in the sensational sense, he spoke of the ordinary human experience intersecting with forces beyond comprehension. The cross's presence was deliberate. It measured faith, observed doubt, and responded not with violence but with quiet insistence. Those who had underestimated it had paid, not with dramatic horror, but with the slow erosion of certainty and the subtle corruption of routine. The lessons of its history were both confessional and cautionary, a reminder that even those most devoted could be unprepared for what lay in their daily lives. As he described the previous caretakers, the quiet weight of responsibility became palpable. Men and women who had carried the cross often aged prematurely, their lives punctuated by moments of inexplicable fatigue, sleepless nights, and an emotional burden that could not be shared with the world. They had been ordinary people, chosen not for heroism but for their willingness to endure. Father Lucas's own life had been shaped by these predecessors. He had never sought glory, only the capacity to act when the need arose, guided by the boundaries imposed by the cross itself. Each decision to intervene came with a cost, sometimes emotional, sometimes moral. Safety was never free, the cross exacted its price quietly, invisibly, but never unjustly. He paused, letting the silence stretch before continuing. I understood then that what I had experienced in the days since the subtle disturbances began was part of this continuum. The cross had observed me, measured my reactions, and now my choices would determine how the next chapter unfolded. There was no room for spectacle or dramatization. Every quiet shift in the air, every subtle movement of shadows, every instinctual hesitation carried significance. Faith was not tested by lightning or fire but by patience, observation, and the endurance of subtle horror. The cross required vigilance, and the weight of knowledge demanded participation. Father Lucas handed me a small, worn case containing a miniature crucifix, intricately carved and weathered by decades of use. "It is not protection in the way you imagine," he said softly, "but it is a guide, a reminder, and a burden. Carry it with respect. Do not underestimate its responsibility." I held it carefully, feeling its presence as if it exhaled a quiet awareness. I realized that my understanding of danger, of faith, and of ordinary life had shifted irrevocably. The cross had been in my home long before the disturbances began, but now it awaited recognition. My role in its history, previously untested, was about to be demanded. That night, as I returned home, I placed the miniature cross on my dresser beside the one that hung above, noticing the faint warmth in my hands as I set it down. The shadows of my room seemed to deepen, stretching toward the corners in a deliberate, measured way. I could feel the quiet presence, not threatening, not violent, only insistent, as if observing the continuation of its long history through me. For the first time, I understood that the small town of Texas I had taken for granted held mysteries that were patient, intelligent, and enduring. The cross had been waiting, the responsibility had arrived, and nothing in the familiar routines of life would remain untouched. The weight of knowledge was mine now, and with it came both fear and understanding. I could not yet say how the next days would unfold, but I sensed with every instinct that my faith, my family, and the quiet life I had known were about to be tested in ways I could not yet comprehend. The days that followed brought a weight I could not have imagined. At first, the signs were subtle misplaced objects, fleeting shadows at the edges of vision, the quiet sensation that someone was observing me even in empty rooms. I tried to convince myself it was fatigue, the stress of normal life blending with memories of Father Lucas's confessions. But the awareness never left. Every glance at the crosses, both the one above my dresser and the miniature crucifix he had given me, brought a feeling that they were not just objects, but sentient witnesses, measuring my actions and patience. It was exhausting, the quiet pressure of being watched, not threatened, not overtly harmed, just observed with an insistence that demanded vigilance. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a muted orange, I noticed the first auditory sign, a low, rhythmic tapping. It started at the window, almost imperceptible, then moved across the walls, echoing through the empty corners of the house. My heart pounded, not with fear of immediate danger, but with the tension of knowing that something invisible was aware of my presence, testing boundaries I could not yet understand. I reached for the miniature crucifix, holding it tightly, and a strange warmth pulsed through my fingers. It was not protection in a conventional sense, but a guide, reminding me to observe, to endure, to remain patient. The nights became longer, filled with subtle disruptions. Doors creaked without wind, shadows moved against the predictable angles of furniture, and the air carried a heaviness that pressed against the chest, unrelenting and unidentifiable. It was as though the cross itself had begun to influence the house, turning familiar spaces into unfamiliar territory. I slept in short stretches, each awakening bringing a new, quiet challenge, a whisper at the edge of hearing, a fleeting figure glimpsed in the hall. I found myself questioning every sound, every movement, unable to distinguish between imagination and reality. The psychological strain was relentless. Family life grew tense. My younger brother, normally oblivious to abstract fears, began to exhibit unease around the house. He would wake in the middle of the night, pointing toward corners where no one stood, murmuring about shadows that moved with purpose. I tried to calm him, attributing his fear to childish imagination, but even he grew insistent. The cross seemed to respond subtly, not banishing the fear but measuring how we coped, how our faith held under pressure. I realized that the burden was no longer just mine, it had quietly spread to anyone within proximity, testing endurance and moral courage in quiet, personal ways. Father Lucas had warned me, but his words took on weight now that I lived them. Faith will be tested, not by spectacle, but by the decisions you cannot avoid. And indeed, the test was subtle but constant. I was forced to confront choices that felt morally ambiguous, moments when my instinct was to flee or ignore, but the cross demanded attention, deliberation, and responsibility. One evening, I found a small collection of objects: candles, a worn Bible, and an old photograph of a family I did not recognize arranged on the kitchen table. I had not placed them there. The air was thick with expectation. Should I disturb the arrangement or leave it? Should I confront the unknown or pretend ignorance? Every decision seemed small yet irreversible, every action carrying consequence beyond immediate comprehension. Sleep became fragmented, each brief rest punctuated by dreams that felt less like imagination and more like memory, experiences of people I did not know but whose suffering was palpable. I awoke drenched in sweat, the crucifix clutched to my chest, the quiet weight of responsibility pressing harder with each passing day. Even when alone, I felt the presence of the cross as a living entity, not merely a symbol. Its influence was not dramatic but persistent, shaping my thoughts, my reactions, and my ability to function within the routines of normal life. The psychological pressure was constant, subtle, and merciless in its quiet insistence. The moral conflict became pronounced when I noticed that some disturbances affected my neighbors. A friend's child, left briefly in my care, seemed to sense the same oppressive awareness, waking repeatedly at night and whispering about shapes moving in the corners. I could not explain it. Should I involve others, risk exposure, or attempt to shoulder the burden alone as Father Lucas had instructed? The weight of responsibility grew heavier as the cross demanded vigilance and moral courage simultaneously. Each interaction became a test, a moment where faith and responsibility intersected in ways that challenged not just my belief but my endurance. As the escalation continued, subtle physical phenomena began to accompany the psychological pressure. Objects shifted, faint scratches appeared on wooden surfaces, and the temperature in specific areas of the house would drop sharply without explanation. Nothing overtly threatening occurred, but the cumulative effect was exhausting, a constant reminder that the cross was active, aware, and unyielding. It was a slow, persistent test of emotional resilience. I began keeping a journal, noting each event, each decision, each moral dilemma, but even writing did not relieve the weight, it only documented the relentless scrutiny of an unseen presence. By the end of the second week, I understood that the escalation was not punishment but preparation. The cross was shaping my endurance, measuring my ability to remain composed under continuous, subtle stress. Faith was no longer comforting, it was a tool, a standard against which I would be tested. I had no certainty of success, only the imperative to observe, decide, and maintain vigilance. Every interaction, every night, every choice became a lesson in restraint, moral courage, and psychological endurance. It was a slow, unyielding challenge that demanded everything without promise of reprieve or reward. And yet, even as the pressure mounted, a strange clarity emerged. I began to understand the delicate balance the cross maintained between containment and observation, between protection and moral accountability. Each event, subtle as it was, revealed a pattern. Evil was not chaotic but measured, patient, and intelligent. The cross did not fight it, it contained it, delayed it, and prepared those who bore witness to endure. My faith, once passive, became active, tested by observation, choice, and the quiet demand for courage. Every night, the weight pressed heavier, and every morning, the consequences of previous decisions unfolded, shaping not only the house but my understanding of morality, responsibility, and the silent endurance of unseen forces. I could no longer doubt Father Lucas's warnings. The escalation was deliberate, purposeful, and intimately tied to the presence of the cross. There was no spectacle, no dramatic confrontation, only the quiet intensification of subtle phenomena and moral dilemmas, all designed to prepare me for what would come. The cross demanded participation, endurance, and an understanding that protection was never free, and that moral courage would be measured in quiet decisions, in the patience to observe, and in the strength to act when the moment required more than instinct or fear. Each night, the house felt alive, not hostile, not threatening, but insistent, reminding me that the responsibility I had inherited was real, immediate, and irrevocable. The first real cost arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, yet it changed everything. My younger brother, who had been uneasy in the presence of the cross, suddenly fell ill, though no doctor could explain the symptoms. Fever, tremors, and a constant agitation plagued him, leaving my mother frantic and me paralyzed by helplessness. At first, I thought it coincidental, a natural illness, but the timing was precise, calculated almost, following days when the subtle disturbances in the house had intensified. I realized with growing dread that the cross demanded balance. Its containment came at a price, and that price was sometimes paid by those closest to us. I held the miniature crucifix tightly that night, watching my brother toss and turn in the dim glow of the bedside lamp. I whispered prayers I barely believed, calling out to a God I had taken for granted, begging for mercy, for guidance, for understanding. But the cross offered no miracles, no immediate relief, only quiet insistence. It demanded observation, endurance, and action, but the toll was undeniable. Every tear, every groan, every shiver from my brother seemed to echo the weight of the responsibility I had assumed. The cost of vigilance had arrived, and it was as intimate as it was unrelenting. In the following days, I noticed that subtle disruptions began to focus around those I cared for most. My mother found objects misplaced, doors unlocked, or furniture shifted, not violently, but in ways that implied observation. She did not understand, and I could not explain without revealing the burden I had inherited from Father Lucas. I watched as small irritations compounded into emotional strain, and I understood that the cross's presence was demanding not only faith but moral endurance, emotional resilience, and vigilance in protecting those who were inadvertently endangered. The consequences of inaction, even unintentional, were immediate and deeply personal. One evening, as the sun sank low and shadows stretched across the rooms, my mother found a small note tucked under the miniature crucifix I kept on my dresser. It was not written in my hand. The ink was faint, but the words were unmistakable: observe, endure, protect. The message was not threatening, but it carried weight. It was an instruction, a reminder, and a warning all at once. I realized then that the cost of the cross was continuous, not momentary. Every decision, every act of neglect, every lapse in attention would be met with consequences that were quiet, yet profound, shaping reality in ways that could not be undone. The emotional toll became tangible when my brother's condition worsened without explanation. Sleepless nights stretched into days, and I found myself unable to separate normal concern from the deliberate influence of the cross. The atmosphere of our home had shifted. The familiar had become a testing ground, where the sacred demanded compliance, awareness, and moral courage. Each time I hesitated, questioned, or failed to act, the subtle disturbances intensified. It was not malevolent in a dramatic sense, but it was relentless in its quiet insistence. Survival required more than instinct, it required moral clarity under pressure. Father Lucas's lessons echoed in my mind: faith was not protection, and vigilance had a cost. I came to understand that the cross did not act out of vengeance or cruelty. Its purpose was to preserve, to contain, and to measure the endurance of those who bore its responsibility. But containment was transactional, demanding sacrifice, attention, and moral courage. The cost was rarely immediate in a visible way, it was measured in fatigue, emotional strain, and, in my brother's case, physical suffering that seemed to serve no purpose other than to instill awareness and accountability. The subtlety of the consequences made them more unbearable. My mother, unaware of the true nature of the disturbances, grew anxious and exhausted, often questioning her own perception of reality. My brother's agitation became a mirror, reflecting the weight of responsibility I could neither avoid nor share. The cross exacted its toll quietly, in ways that eroded normalcy, altered perception, and demanded constant vigilance. Every normal interaction became fraught with moral complexity, every choice carrying unseen repercussions. I could not rest, could not speak freely, and could not allow others to bear what I had inherited. One night, as I sat watching over my brother, the temperature in the room dropped suddenly. The lamp flickered, casting shadows that danced across the walls, elongating and shrinking as though alive. My brother shivered violently, whispering that he felt watched even while asleep. I held the crucifix over him, whispering the prayers I had learned, feeling the faint warmth pulse through my hands. The cross did not prevent the distress but mediated it, maintaining a fragile balance between containment and endurance. I understood then that protection was not absolute. It came at a cost that was quiet, intimate, and unavoidable. Even as I bore witness to these consequences, I felt the subtle reassurance of the cross's presence. It did not remove danger, it did not silence suffering, but it guided attention, tested moral fortitude, and measured endurance. The cost had been paid, but it also served as a reminder that vigilance could preserve life in ways subtle yet profound. I began to see the delicate equilibrium the cross demanded. Every act of neglect, every moment of weakness, every lapse in moral clarity amplified the unseen pressures, while careful observation and courage mitigated them. By the end of the week, my brother began to recover, slowly, as if the balance had been restored through continuous attention and moral fortitude. The fever receded, the tremors subsided, and the quiet pressure in the house lessened slightly, but the lesson remained indelible. Protection was never free. Responsibility carried consequences, subtle yet profound, and faith was measured not in comfort or miracles, but in endurance, observation, and moral courage under continuous pressure. I realized that the escalation was only a prelude. The cross's work was ongoing, a constant reminder that even the familiar, even the sacred, demanded vigilance, and the consequences of failing that vigilance were both immediate and enduring. The emotional weight was unrelenting. I could no longer separate normal life from the demands of the cross. Each interaction, each decision, each act of care required awareness, moral clarity, and patience. The subtle disturbances persisted, but their intensity was a measure of our compliance and endurance. The cost had been paid, but it would never truly end. I understood that living with the cross meant living with constant responsibility, and that the consequences of inaction could strike quietly, personally, and irrevocably. The quiet toll was the true measure of faith. The realization came gradually, like a fog rolling over familiar landscapes, obscuring what I had once believed to be safe and unshakable. It began one quiet morning when I found myself alone in the living room, the house empty except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. The miniature crucifix lay on the table, ordinary in appearance, yet I felt its presence as a weight pressing on my chest, demanding acknowledgement. I understood, suddenly, that the cross was not a talisman to destroy evil, nor a charm to keep harm away. It was a vessel, a boundary, a containment. It did not confront the darkness, it held it, paused it, measured it. All my previous experiences, the subtle taps on windows, the shadows, my brother's fever, the emotional strain on my mother, were not isolated incidents. They were signals, tests, calibrations of my endurance. The cross was intelligent in its purpose, patient in its methods, and unwavering in its demands. Evil, I realized, was not chaotic, it was deliberate, methodical, and aware. Every movement, every whisper, every disturbance had a pattern I could now discern. It did not rush. It waited, observed, and adapted, gauging my response and adjusting its influence accordingly. The revelation was both terrifying and clarifying. Nothing I had faced had been random. I remembered Father Lucas's warnings, the solemn way he had spoken in his small Texas parish years earlier. Faith will be tested not by spectacle, but by your willingness to endure and make choices that cannot be undone. I had not understood then. Now, the weight of that statement pressed upon me. The cross demanded more than belief, it demanded vigilance, moral courage, and the quiet acceptance of responsibility. It was not a reward for the faithful, but a standard of endurance, a measure of the soul's capacity to act rightly under pressure. As I pondered this, subtle activity began anew. A lamp shifted slightly without contact, casting shadows that seemed to move in slow, purposeful sweeps. The air carried a chill that could not be attributed to weather. My younger brother, who had grown more wary each day, watched silently, his small hands clutching a blanket as though it offered protection from forces neither of us could name. The cross pulsed faintly in my grip, not with warmth, but with an almost sentient insistence, a reminder that vigilance and moral clarity were necessary not for comfort, but for survival. It was then that I discovered the final, haunting truth. The cross did not banish evil. It did not destroy it. It contained it, delayed it, held it in check. The relief I had once imagined safety secured, danger removed was an illusion. Evil was patient, adaptive, and aware. It was capable of waiting for the exact moment when a lapse in judgment, a failure in endurance, or a quiet act of negligence could provide an opportunity. Faith was not victory, it was resistance, an active state of engagement rather than passive assurance. This understanding reshaped every decision, every interaction, every breath I took in that house in Texas. The moral dimension of this revelation was profound. Protection required more than awareness, it required deliberate, consistent action. Neglect or hesitation, however small, could shift the balance. The cross imposed this silently, without drama, without spectacle, making every choice heavy with consequence. I could no longer afford the luxury of doubt or distraction. Even the simplest acts, preparing meals, tucking my brother into bed, checking the locks, carried moral weight and demanded deliberate mindfulness. The cost of failure was not immediate chaos, but a slow, subtle erosion of safety and faith. I began documenting each occurrence in painstaking detail. Every shadow, every shift in air pressure, every whisper, every tremor in the temperature of the house was recorded with precision. The pattern emerged clearly, the cross acted as both shield and teacher. It restrained the darkness while simultaneously imposing a rigorous test of endurance, morality, and faith. I understood now that previous experiences, the fever, the agitation, the shadows, were all part of a curriculum in resilience. The cross was a teacher, and evil was the lesson, patient and unyielding. The psychological weight grew heavier with each passing day. I could feel my own beliefs bending, stretching, tested against the reality of containment. The cross demanded a level of engagement that went beyond prayer or ritual. It required observation, analysis, and moral action. Every time I hesitated, I felt the subtle backlash of consequence. I began to comprehend that this was the true nature of the test: survival under continuous, intelligent pressure. Faith was not a shield, it was a lens through which endurance was measured. Then came the moment of undeniable clarity. One evening, the house fell completely silent. No creaks, no taps, no shadows shifting at the edges of vision. My brother slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, and my mother sat quietly, unaware of the deliberate calm that had settled over our home. I held the crucifix, now fully aware of its function, and for the first time understood the duality it represented. The cross contained the darkness, yes, but it did not neutralize it. Evil waited, aware, adaptable, and always patient. Our safety was contingent on our engagement, our vigilance, and our moral clarity. It was a revelation that altered my perception permanently. I could never see the cross as merely a religious object, nor could I assume that faith alone offered protection. The cross was a responsibility, a burden, a measure of endurance. Evil was not an external force to be vanquished, but an adaptive intelligence to be resisted. Faith became active, morality became immediate, and vigilance became the foundation of existence. I realized that nothing had ended, that danger was not absent, and that the cross demanded constant engagement with the reality it contained. In that quiet moment, I also understood the scope of what Father Lucas had left behind. He had not given me a tool of power, but a test of responsibility. The cross was not an instrument of heroism, it was a measure of endurance, a device to train those capable of observing, acting, and protecting without spectacle or drama. The revelation was heavy, sobering, and unyielding. Faith alone could not shield, courage alone could not protect, and yet both were necessary to fulfill the silent mandate of the cross. I knew then that our lives had changed irrevocably. The cross would remain, and with it, the understanding that evil was patient, adaptive, and aware. Vigilance and moral clarity were not optional, they were required for every choice, every action, every thought. There would be no moment of triumph, no dramatic confrontation, only continuous observation, endurance, and moral engagement. The revelation was complete, the cross contained, faith resisted, and evil endured, patient and calculating, ever waiting for the moment when vigilance faltered. The night arrived as though the world itself had paused, holding its breath. The wind whispered through the trees outside, carrying a cold that seemed to pierce deeper than the skin, settling in the bones and in the air of the house. Every creak of the floorboards sounded magnified, each shadow elongated unnaturally, and my brother's breathing, steady moments ago, became shallow and uneven. The cross rested heavily in my hands, its presence a constant reminder of what we faced. I realized fully, with a sinking weight, that this was the culmination, the moment when endurance and vigilance were tested without respite. Silence dominated the rooms, thick and almost tangible, pressing against the walls and ceilings. The disturbances we had grown accustomed to, the subtle taps, the faint shadows, the whispered suggestions of movement had vanished, replaced by a void that felt heavier than any sound. I understood immediately that absence was not safety. Evil was patient. It waited. It gathered strength in anticipation, observing our every move, measuring our reactions, calculating the smallest lapse. Every instinct screamed that the night would demand everything we had. My mother sat across the room, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, eyes wide but fixed on the cross I held. My brother, exhausted, slept fitfully in the next room, unaware of the full weight of what had been unfolding for months. The house, once familiar, felt alien, each corner a potential hiding place for forces we could not name. I moved slowly, deliberately, checking doors, windows, and the faint outlines of furniture in the dim lamplight. The cross pulsed faintly in my grip, as though reminding me that endurance alone would not suffice. Observation, clarity, and moral courage were required in equal measure. Hours passed, though time felt suspended. Shadows shifted not by accident, but with intent, curling and stretching as though alive. A faint murmur seemed to echo in the distance, just at the edge of perception, teasing the mind into imagining figures, voices, movements that might not exist or might be more real than comprehension allowed. The cross was my anchor, a fragile containment that demanded attention without distraction, vigilance without hysteria. Every step, every gesture, every breath was measured against an unseen standard. The night offered no relief, only the relentless insistence that we remain awake, alert, and morally clear. At one point, a soft knock echoed from the front door. My heart jumped, and instinctively I held the crucifix higher. The sound was deliberate, slow, almost ceremonial in timing. It was neither threatening nor comforting. I realized in that moment that evil had adapted, testing our restraint, measuring the boundaries of courage and faith. I did not move toward the door. Instead, I whispered prayers, not for protection, but for clarity. The knock ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed even closer than before, suffocating in its weight. Minutes blurred into hours, or perhaps seconds into eternities. A faint flicker of lamplight revealed movement in the corner of my vision. The shadows themselves seemed to breathe, rising and falling with imperceptible rhythm. My brother stirred in his sleep, murmuring words that were not his own. My mother's grip on her chair tightened as she sensed the pressure in the room, though she could not articulate it. The cross remained in my hands, steady and insistent, a conduit of moral and spiritual endurance. I understood, fully, that the night's challenge was not in spectacle, but in the collapse of perceived safety. The familiar no longer offered comfort, the sacred no longer guaranteed protection. Then came the moment of irreversible understanding. A sudden, almost imperceptible change in the air, the faintest drop in temperature, the subtlest shift in shadows signaled that vigilance alone was insufficient. The darkness was present, aware, patient, yet not chaotic. It had adapted to our patterns, observed our responses, and now tested our ability to maintain moral clarity under pressure. I held the cross over my brother as he stirred, whispering the prayers I had long recited, not expecting miracles, but affirming the endurance demanded by the burden I carried. Every word, every gesture, every act of attention became a shield, a declaration that responsibility had not faltered. The climax was not violent. There was no dramatic confrontation, no loud scream, no cinematic display of horror. Instead, it was silent, methodical, and absolute. Shadows pressed closer, and the house seemed to breathe with intention, yet the cross held. Evil did not retreat, but neither did it advance beyond the boundaries contained by our vigilance. The tension was total, complete, and relentless, testing not our courage in battle, but our capacity for endurance, observation, and moral responsibility. Every heartbeat, every whispered prayer, every careful motion was measured against a standard only the cross could impose. Finally, as the night wore on toward the first faint light of dawn, the oppressive weight lifted slightly, though the vigilance remained. The cross had held, the containment maintained, but the lesson was clear: safety was temporary, endurance was continuous, and moral clarity was not optional. We had survived the night, not through heroism, but through attention, observation, and steadfast engagement with the responsibility that had been imposed. The cross did not grant peace, it demanded awareness. Evil remained, patient and adaptive, and the collapse of safety had not ended. In the quiet after the night's apex, I felt the true cost of what we had endured. We had survived, yes, but at the price of innocence, complacency, and the illusion of security. The house, once a sanctuary, was now a test of moral and spiritual endurance, a constant reminder that the sacred demanded attention, and that evil waited for the smallest lapse. The cross had not failed, but it had not erased the presence of darkness. It had merely contained it, measured our responses, and forced recognition of our own limitations. By the time sunlight filtered weakly through the blinds, the immediate threat receded, though its memory remained indelible. The cross rested on the table, quiet, ordinary, yet imbued with the weight of responsibility, endurance, and moral clarity. We had endured the night, but the ordeal had fundamentally altered perception, faith, and the understanding of vigilance. Evil was patient. Faith was resistance. And the cross remained, not as a shield, but as a demanding measure of endurance, a silent witness to every act, every choice, and every lapse that defined our survival. The days that followed were quiet in a way that was both comforting and unsettling. The house in Texas looked the same, the furniture remained in place, and the sun rose and set as it always had, but the air carried a weight that could not be measured, only felt. The cross rested on the mantel, ordinary to any observer, but I knew its presence was not passive. It had fulfilled its function for the night, yet it demanded continued attention, vigilance, and moral clarity. Nothing had ended, everything had shifted. I moved through the routines of daily life with a heightened awareness, noticing the smallest irregularities, the faint tap of a floorboard, the subtle chill in a corner, the slight shadow that did not belong. Each was a reminder that the cross did not eliminate darkness, but contained it. Faith was no longer comfort, it was responsibility, an active engagement with the reality that evil persisted, patient, calculating, and adaptive. My brother played outside, his laughter lighter than before, yet I felt the tension in every movement, knowing that safety was temporary and vigilance was constant. My mother seemed less burdened, yet her eyes betrayed a quiet worry she refused to articulate. The house, once a sanctuary, had become a place of careful observation. Every interaction, every decision, carried moral weight. The cross had revealed its true nature, a test of endurance, not a protective charm. Evil was contained, but not destroyed, and the responsibility to uphold that containment rested upon us, quietly, relentlessly. We had survived the night, but survival was not peace, it was awareness, a measure of attentiveness that could not be relaxed. I began to speak more openly about what had occurred, though not in detail, not in the way that might invite disbelief or sensationalism. Instead, I shared fragments of experience with trusted friends, colleagues, and parish members, emphasizing the lessons of vigilance, endurance, and moral clarity. They listened politely, some with curiosity, others with polite dismissal, but the act of speaking was necessary. Silence had been a burden, confession offered a small relief, though it did not alter the reality of the cross, the darkness, or our moral obligations. The cross remained a constant presence in our home, a weighty reminder of the night when safety collapsed and faith was tested. I noticed subtle patterns, minor disturbances that seemed to signal awareness, gentle reminders that our engagement could not cease. Shadows shifted deliberately, winds whispered almost conversationally, and faint sounds echoed in spaces where none should exist. Each was a reminder that the darkness was contained, not defeated, and that our moral and spiritual attention was required to maintain that containment. There were moments of exhaustion, when the weight of responsibility pressed too heavily, when I longed for the simplicity of belief without consequence, yet the cross would pulse faintly, reminding me of its purpose. It demanded moral clarity and endurance, and I could not shirk these obligations. Even small lapses, a distracted glance, a forgotten prayer, a moment of doubt seemed amplified, measured, observed. The cross was not judgmental, but it was aware, and it required continuous engagement with the principles it enforced. In the evenings, I would watch the Texas sky darken, knowing that nightfall carried more than ordinary stillness. Shadows deepened, the wind shifted, and silence became a companion rather than a relief. The experience had changed the way I perceived time, space, and the ordinary movements of life. Every choice carried weight. Every action mattered. Survival was no longer instinct, it was a deliberate, continuous moral engagement, and the cross was the silent arbiter of this responsibility. I understood fully now that the story was not about heroism, spectacle, or dramatic confrontation. It was about endurance, observation, and moral clarity. The cross was not a charm to protect, it was a measure of readiness, a silent judge of vigilance. Evil was adaptive, patient, and intelligent. It waited, always waiting, observing each choice, measuring each action. Our faith was no longer comfort, it was a responsibility, a method of resistance, a declaration that we were aware, vigilant, and morally accountable. Before concluding, I feel compelled to ask those listening now to consider their own place in this world. Where are you listening from? What city or town do you call home? As you hear this, reflect upon the fragility of ordinary life, the unseen responsibilities we carry, and the weight of vigilance that faith may demand. Share your location and your thoughts in the comments. Engage not only with the story but with the awareness it demands. Life continues, yet nothing remains unchanged. And so, the cross remains on the mantle. Shadows linger in corners. The house is quiet but watchful. My family carries forward, conscious that evil persists, contained but adaptive. Faith is no longer a comfort, but a continuous engagement, a measure of endurance and moral clarity. We live with awareness, understanding that the night may come again, darkness may test us again, and vigilance must never cease. This is not the end. It is the continuation of responsibility, the quiet maintenance of containment, and the enduring measure of endurance that the cross demands.